Good morning and good afternoon to everybody who is on the call. Thank you very much for joining this webinar. My name is Puleng Njuli Potele, and I am broadcasting here from UNEP FI. Okay, so the purpose of the webinar today is to go through the guidance document. So most of you would be aware that we launched the principles on the 22nd of September in New York, and together with the launching of the principles, we also launched the guidance document. So the history of the guidance document is that it was initially released during the global public consultation for comment and feedback, and we did receive quite a lot of feedback on the document, and so we have made some amendments to the document, quite a lot of amendments to the document, to its structure as well as to its content, and so we will be going through that. Just to mention that we now have 140 signatories to the principles, and 3/4 of the banking membership have now become signatories to the principles. And it is now time to turn our attention to implementation. And of course, the guidance document is one tool that helps provide support to banks for implementation of the principles. And one very important feature that we have added to the document in its revised form is an example of implementation. So it's an illustrative example, not based on the experience of any bank, given that the principles have just been launched and all banks are getting started with implementation. But we have put together an example of what implementation over the first 4 years of implementation of the principles could look like, and that will form quite a big part of our presentation today. So I am joined by Marius Calvet from Banorte, Neru Pillay from Land Bank, as well as Demetrius Dimopoulos from Piraeus Bank. So I will just move to the agenda here. So we will begin with a presentation on recapping the principles and then an introduction to the guidance document. We'll move into the illustrative example of implementation that I just mentioned a moment ago, and then into the illustrative example of target setting, which forms part of this example. All of this information can, of course, be found in the guidance document, which is available online, and you should all also have received these slides by email. I will then close the presentation by giving some information around the next steps, and then we will open up for questions. I would encourage you to, at any point that you do have questions during the presentation, to just drop us a note, and we will address those as and when we are able to. I also encourage you to put up your hand. I think we'll field those questions at the end of the presentation, but I do encourage you to put up your hand, and I will unmute you at that point so that you can then speak and provide us with your question. So let us then get started. So I'll hand over to Marius to give us a recap of the principles and an introduction to the guidance document. Marius, over to you.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining the webinar. Well, the first thing is to welcome also the new signatories, and not as new signatories, but everybody that has joined this initiative. The first slide here, just as Puleng said, you all know that the principles were recently launched. The framework is ready, and the first thing to present is the 6 principles. And as you may already know, we have the documents that are going to guide us to the implementation, a non-binding document that will be updated periodically for us signatories, not to change the way it's meant to be implemented, but to include new resources that are going to be helping us periodically to implement these principles. So As you know, there are 6 principles for responsible banking. The first one is the principle of alignment. And by alignment, we mean that we will align our business strategy to be consistent with and to contribute to individuals' needs and society's goals as they are expressed in the Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Climate Agreement, and other relevant national or regional or local frameworks that we believe that we can align our business strategy, our products and services to. So as you will see, and it will be presented further in the webinar, in the guidance document, you will find different examples as to what does alignment mean, what are we expected to do to align our strategy, products and services to these society's goals, and some examples of how banks have been doing it. So this is the first principle, and we are to decide in the context where we have operations and in the regions or geographies, which are the frameworks that are relevant for our business to decide to align our strategy towards them. So that is the first principle. The second principle is the principle of impact and target setting. So these principles implies like a continuous work to increase our positive impacts, and also a continuous work to reduce the negative impacts on and managing the risks to people and environment resulting from our activities, products, and services. To this end, we will set and publish targets where we can have the most significant impacts. This is one of, well, all principles are very important, but this is one of the most important ones. So we are to set up targets after we try to increase our positive impact and reduce our negative impact of our products and services. We are to set targets that are meant for us to scale this positive impact and to measure how we do contribute to these international or local frameworks that we decided to align our business to. As it is going to be presented further on, the targets can be set quantitative or qualitative, but we always need to have a mechanism to monitor the progress towards our targets, and all the targets need to be specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. So we need to set up a time frame where they will be met, and also a mechanism to monitor the progress and to report our progress towards our targets. So this, I would dare to say that this is one of the most important principles for the implementation of our strategy. The third principle is the principle that relates with clients and customers. The third principle implies that signatories will work responsibly with our clients and our customers to encourage sustainable practices and enable economic activities that create shared prosperity for current and future generations. So principle 3, and as you will see a little further, principle number 4, imply that a signatory bank needs to have a proactive behavior towards our clients, and as you will see in principle number 4 with stakeholders, that we will be proactive, raising awareness of what our strategy is, raising awareness of the possibilities of developing new products or services that align and that contribute to different societies' goals. This means that we also will incentivize our clients for sustainable behavior or for sustainable investments. We will keep informing them constantly of our strategy. We will also do partnerships with them. Yes? Okay. We will also do partnerships, and we need to map all the spectrum of our retail customers looking for potential sustainable related behavior where we can participate with them to scale up our positive impact with our clients. So this is like an engagement principle. The principle number 4 is also an engagement principles towards our stakeholders. It reads that we will proactively and responsibly consult, engage, and partner with relevant stakeholders to achieve society's goals. This means that we will also identify which are the key stakeholders around our bank. There is no bank that works alone. We are all part of a social system where the only way to scale up our positive impact is to work with the stakeholders that are around us. We need to map which are the key stakeholders and engage with them, partner with them, consult with them to increase this impact. So as you will be told a little later with examples, but in the guidance document, you can find examples as to how we can engage with regulators. We can do maybe with lobbying or be promoting to strengthen an ecosystem that enables us to develop better products and services towards sustainable activities. The 5th principle is the principle of governance and culture. It reads that we will implement our commitment to these principles through effective governance and a culture of responsible banking. So these principles implies an internal work of every signatory bank to develop the leadership and to strengthen the daily business culture of the whole bank to be able to implement these principles. So we need to set up a governance structure where the roles towards the implementation of the principles are defined, the responsibilities, where we have the possibility to have the resources for this to happen. It also implies that we need to have internal expertise towards these topics and a specialized and dedicated team whose expertise can help the whole bank to implement the principles. So what this implies is that the implementation of the principles cannot be done alone by one person that is supposed to be the sustainability manager. This implies that the whole bank needs to be trained, needs to be consulted, and needs to be involved in this strategy, and everybody needs to work around this governance structure that is to be set for the implementation of the principles. That is the only way that leadership throughout the organization can be permeated so we can implement the principles. And the last principle is the principle of transparency and accountability. This principle reads that we will periodically review our individual and collective implementation of these principles and be transparent about and accountable for our positive and negative impacts and our contribution to society's goals. So every time we talk about the principle of transparency and about the need for reporting on how we are doing on our progress of the implementation of the principles, many questions arise as to, is there a need for a special report? So what we need to do is to be reporting our sustainability strategy, and we need, within the same report that we do yearly, we will include with the help of a template to report that it has been set up by all these principles structure. We will be reporting on our progress, and when you became signatories, the first report on your progress needs to be presented on 18 months, and then yearly in the same document where you report all your economic, social, and environmental activities. So this is principle number 6. I don't know if I need to stop for questions, or do we go on, Puleng?
Maurice, I suggest let's carry on until the end of your slides, and then we'll see if there's any questions at that point.
Great. So on the next slide, please, Puleng, which are the concrete actions that us signatory banks need to take for implementation? Well, we first need to assess which are the frameworks that are relevant in our operating environment, and we need to identify the society's key goals and reevaluate our business strategy. We need also to conduct an impact analysis to understand where our bank has or can have significant impacts on your society, on society's goals. We need to eventually, as we follow on the implementation of the principles, and when the bank is ready, we need to set and publish and implement targets in the areas where our bank can have the greatest impact. These targets need to be ambitious enough to objectively drive alignment with society's goals. And as we said in the principles, concrete action, and a very important one, is to engage proactively with our clients, with our customers, and with all the stakeholders towards more sustainable outcomes and greater impacts. We also need to embed the principles in our governance structure, as I was telling you, to ensure delivery of our commitments and bring an effective oversight. We need to engage our employees in order to drive culture change in our bank. This means that we need to go beyond the sustainability team or leader. We need to really train and to give workshops to the employees, so there is like a culture throughout the organization where they understand that this is part of the whole business strategy, and they are not goals of a specific area of the bank. It's a whole sustainability strategy that is across all the bank's areas. And of course, we need to report within 18 months of signing how are we doing on the progress on implementing the principles, and we will report annually after that, including completing the reporting and self-assessment template that was developed to give us banks the possibility to have a template on how to report. So the next slide refers to the three documents that constitute the whole framework for the principles for responsible banking. It is, of course, the principal signature document where the 6 principles are laid out, and also why the principles for responsible banking were developed and why are us bankings becoming signatories. What are we trying to achieve? So this is the document that our CEOs signed. So this is the first and most important document for signatories. And then the key steps to be implemented by signatories is the second document that we need to take into account in the framework, and the reporting and self-assessment template. And the supporting document that can help us go through the implementation is the guidance document, which will be presented in this webinar. On the next slide, you will see how the guidance document is set. This guidance document supports how we implement the principles in our organizations, and it's a non-binding practical guidance for us banks on measures that we can take to implement each one of the principles. It is a very interesting document because it gives us concrete actions on how to implement each one of the principles, and it also gives us resources that we can use towards the implementation of each principle. For example, on principle number 1, that is related to the alignment, it gives us resources and links to different documents that can help us align our organization to society's goals. For example, the SDG Compass, or maybe even the science-based targets, or maybe the international labor standards for different social goals. So it gives us different resources for each one of the principles for us to be able to have more frameworks and more resources to implement. So on the next slide, I think that this might be the end of this part. Let me see. Well, so the structure of the document, as you will see, it is divided into the 6 principles. So on the first part, you can read what the principle is about. It will have an introductory paragraph that sets out the intention of each one of the principles, which I already read to you. But then you will see a summary of what the principle requires from signatories, as we expect and is set out in the framework documents, and suggested measures that we can take to implement each principle. And then, as I said, we have key resources that each of us banks can use in the implementation of each of the principles. And very interesting, you will find examples of different banks in different parts of the world on how they implement each one of the principles. So each principle has each one of these points that ends with practical examples as to what does it mean to implement each one of the principles. So the illustrative example of the implementation of the principles shows like a fictitious bank, what had been done. So over the first 4 years of implementation, we are expected to be working on this progress. Each example focuses on each principle and also includes illustrative examples of target setting, which is one of the topics that may be of worry for some of the banks. And we have many resources and examples as to how targets have been set. So this is how the guidance document is structured and how it can help us implement the principles in each one of our organizations. Is there another slide, Puleng?
No, Marius, that would be it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, so before we move on to the next part of the presentation, I do have a question. One is, so Michelle Espinache asks, can you please show the slides? Michelle, you should be able to see the slides if you have come onto the webinar online. You should also have received the slides by email. So just write to me and let me know whether you haven't received them by email, but you should definitely be able to see them. We are broadcasting them. So just let me know so we can try and resolve that for you. Then Andrea Cordero has asked a question, where can we find the guiding documents? So all of the documents are available on our website. We will be sending an email following the webinar that includes the links to both webinars. We held one this morning as well. And we'll include a link to the guidance document. I hope that will be helpful. So those are the questions we have right now. Let us move on. Neru, it's over to you to discuss the illustrative example of implementation.
Okay. Good morning and good afternoon to everybody on the webinar. And as Marius has said, congratulations to all the signatories. It's been an interesting journey for us, but there's lots more work ahead of us. So if we can just a little bit of background around the illustrative example that's already been discussed by Marius, is that when we were looking at the guidance document in preparing the final version of the guidance document, I think the big question that came to mind, and one that we felt that all banks will be asking, is the how-to question. So how do we implement the principles? So even though the guidance document gives examples of how you can implement, what we've done is that we've taken the sort of concrete actions and structured these over 4 years in respect to a hypothetical bank that would be implementing over the 4 years. So this was developed by the core group, and it just gives you an idea of what implementation of the principles could look like over the first 4 years of implementation. As I think Marius has already indicated, it's not binding, and nor is it based on the experience of a real bank. And the purpose of the example is to give structured guidance of the activities signatories can undertake to implement each principle. So in addition to this, all banks that are implementing the principles are encouraged to do more to further deepen your implementation of the principles. And just to remind everyone that the actions suggested are not exhaustive. There are lots more that you could do in terms of implementing each of the principles. So let's dive into the first year of this hypothetical bank. And the first year is all about learning and understanding. It's about where you are in terms of implementation, or what is your bank currently doing, and it's fundamentally about planning for the future. So when we look at the illustrative example, we look at kinds of activities per principle. So if you're thinking about principle number 1, we illustrate that this hypothetical bank identifies the goals set out in the relevant frameworks that are specific relevance to the society in which it operates, and starts to develop an understanding of how it can strategically contribute to these priority goals and challenges. And in many of us, in terms of our own banks, this could be looking at the framework supported by materiality analysis. It's all these different things that can feed into how we look at principle number 1. You will note that principle number 2, there's a very strong emphasis in these sets of principles on impact, and we start off with undertaking an impact analysis of our portfolio to identify the significant positive and negative impacts. Just to say that there are significant and numerous resources available within UNEP FI and related to the positive impact. There is methodologies that are being developed that are available to signatories. They're currently being finalized, and signatories are encouraged to apply the methodologies to help identify the positive and negative impacts. Obviously, the positive and negative impacts in terms of identification, you need to look at where it has the most significant impact. And all of us, we know our business the best. We know where we know what our vision is, what our goal, what our objectives are. We can use all that background to support our understanding and identification of positive and negative impacts. And the second point there is that it determines that it has the bank will determine that it has a substantial exposure to the energy and transport sectors, for instance. It operates in a country with ambitious climate goals, or the bank could identify that gender inequality is a significant challenge, which is expressed as a priority in its government policies. Thirdly, based on all this information, looking specifically at 2 areas, and that could be, one area could be gender, and the other could be climate, as 2 of the significant impact areas that it wants to focus on immediately. Then looking at principle number 3, the bank assesses how clients engaged in sectors and activities associated with significant impacts could transition towards more sustainable and resilient business models. This will help the bank plan how it can support its clients in their transition. So moving on, principle number 4, the bank undertakes a stakeholder mapping exercise to identify key external stakeholders and develops a stakeholder engagement strategy detailing its relevant stakeholders, what to engage them on, and who engages them, how and when. So specifically with respect to principle number 3 and 4, you will note that there's a strong move towards developing partnerships with your clients and with your stakeholders in achieving the objectives of the principles for responsible banking. Moving on to the next slide, Puleng. So principle number 5, specifically on the governance. In terms of the learning and understanding where you are, the bank considers whether its governance structure is adequate for supporting implementation of the principles, determines what the reporting line should be and who is accountable for implementation, establishes a dedicated committee which is responsible for overseeing the implementation of the principles, and periodically reporting to the board on progress. It maps and considers existing and emerging international good practices that are relevant for its implementation of the principles and determines its priorities and ambitions to align with good practice. So specifically, I work in an agricultural bank. We have a board committee which is the overseer of all the social and ethical policies of the bank. So that's in terms of our governance structure. We're looking at how does that align with meeting the principles of responsible banking. And then in year number 1, still looking at principle number 6, also a very important part of the principles is the transparency and accountability component. As Marius already indicated, within 18 months of becoming a signatory to the principles, the bank communicates its progress on implementing the principles in its public reporting. So in your annual report or integrated report, it completes the sections of the reporting and self-assessment template, and that was indicated as one of the key documents for the principles of responsible banking, and also determines and be able, Secondly, the bank is in a position to include its self-assessment in its existing assurance processes. It obtains limited assurance of its self-assessment, which determines the accuracy of the information that the bank relied on in completing its self-assessment. So at this stage, the request is focused on limited assurance. So in my case specifically, we have an internal audit division that will review non-financial indicators as part of its assurance of the first line assurance of the integrated reporting. Then on the third point, the bank engages with the UNEP FI Secretariat for guidance and support on how it can build on its current achievements going into year 2. So obviously this is linked with the reporting and self-assessment template where guidance will be provided, or review and guidance provided by the Secretariat itself. So again, just to emphasize, year 1 is all about learning and understanding, understanding where you are, what's your baseline, and then moving into what do you do next. So if we look at the next slide, which then highlights year 2 and year 3, possible examples of what banks could be doing in year 2 and 3. Again, developing the bank's foundation. And this follows again from year 1 in terms of principle number 1. There were certain things done in terms of identifying the main frameworks. In year 2 and 3, the bank could then be looking at or deciding to include gender equality, climate transition, and pollution as strategic focus areas. It identifies strategic business opportunities that will enable both the bank and society to develop sustainably. On principle number 2, we've started with an impact identification in year 1. Moving on from that in year 2, based on the outcome of that impact analysis, the bank assesses how it can currently address its significant positive and negative impacts and develops strategies for improving existing measures. It sets 2 SMART targets that address 2 distinct most significant potential impacts and develops milestones to meet the targets and measures to monitor progress against the targets. And this will come back later in Dimitrios's presentation around setting targets. And then thirdly, it ensures that its decision-making committees and bodies are aware of actual and potential risks and impacts associated with the bank's activities and incorporates them in their processes. Just to make a point here, you know, all of our institutions, we have the potential to create many positive impacts, and we can build on them, and we have the ability to reduce the many negative impacts that may arise. The identification and setting targets don't end in year 2 and 3, but it's something that we aspire to build on to continuously improve and build on our positive impacts and reduce our negative impacts. So moving on to principle number 3, and building on year 1, the bank then identifies which clients it needs to work with to achieve its targets and begins to engage them. It integrates questions about its clients' and customers' sustainability preferences, their significant impacts, and environmental and social risks into its onboarding process. This is obviously extremely relevant for large diversified portfolios and will work differently depending on the size of those portfolios. On principle number 4, again in year 2 and 3, the bank systematically engages its stakeholders in line with its stakeholder engagement strategy, which was built in year 1 from mapping out their stakeholders. Based on these engagements, the bank gets a better understanding of how it can contribute to the needs of its society through its business. And through this process, it is able to identify stakeholders it can partner with to accelerate its impacts. In my specific case, the key stakeholders to support us in the implementation of our principles on the one hand is our shareholder, which is the national government, and the associated Department of Agriculture and Department of Environmental Affairs. So they would become one of our key stakeholders that we work with to further principle number 4. And moving on to the next slide, Pauline. Okay, again, building on principle number 5, the governance principle, the bank makes further changes to its governance structure and processes in order to facilitate effective implementation of the principles. In some cases, banks may think that they would need a specific or dedicated sustainability committee, either at the executive or board level, that would look at this. These are the kinds of things that banks could consider. It integrates sustainability objectives into decision-making processes across the bank, including sustainability criteria in the terms of reference of the board's nomination policy, and ensuring that existing credit policies, customer treatment, engagement policies, procurement policies are consistent with its strategy. It engages with internal stakeholders to determine what a SMART target could look like for the business, how it could be achieved, business areas that need to be involved, and how much time the bank will need to achieve the target. It develops a strategy for fostering a culture of sustainability to ensure employees are on board. It works on aligning with the good practices it elected to prioritize, adopting a human rights screening process, and becoming a signatory to the Equator Principles. These are all possibilities. Next, on principle number 6, again, transparency and accountability. Each year, the bank reports on the progress it has made thus far in its implementation of the principles. This includes reporting on the targets it has set as well as its KPIs. Again, the bank will complete the reporting and self-assessment template, providing as much information as it is available to do at that stage, and publishes it. the bank is in a position to include self-assessment in its existing assurance processes. It obtains limited assurance of its self-assessment, which determines the accuracy of the information that the bank relied on in completing its self-assessment. And finally, the bank gets feedback and guidance from UNEP FI on its targets and support for how any gaps relating to the targets could be addressed, in addition to getting feedback on other aspects of implementation. So that's possibilities within year 2 and 3. I think if we go into the 4th year of implementation, it's all about building on the foundation from the previous 3 years. So just extending on principle number 1, building on its analysis in year 1 and the targets it has set, the bank revises its overall strategy to align with society's goals, ensuring that its business strategy does not run counter to the achievement of society's goals. On principle number 2, it monitors the progress it is making in implementing its targets to ensure that it's on track with its KPIs. As the bank enters the remaining 2 years to achieve one of its targets, it reevaluates its significant impacts and identifies the next areas of most significant impact in order to begin the process of developing the next targets. On principle number 3, based on the information gathered from the client onboarding process, the bank is able to better structure its existing products and manage its risks while assisting its clients and customers to choose more sustainable practices and business models. On principle number 4, the bank develops and implements a strategy to work in partnership with the identified stakeholders in order to benefit from their expertise and accelerate its impact. Within this, it engages with its policymakers and regulators in order to advocate for policies that create an enabling environment for implementation of the principle and contributing to sustainable development more generally. And moving on to the next or the final 2 principles in year 4, the bank will review its employee incentive structures and revise them in order to ensure they facilitate fair treatment of customers and clients. The bank also ensures that incentives facilitate the effective implementation of the principles by including KPIs in employee contracts. Now that the bank has adopted a human rights screening process and other principles, it starts with the process of mapping and assessing other existing and emerging international regional good practice and establishing which practices it tends to start working towards integrating into existing practices during the following year. And finally, on principle number 6, building on the previous 3 years, the bank ensures that its reporting reflects the progress it has made over the year. Its report includes disclosures of its significant impacts, its risks, the targets it has set, the KPIs that are used to measure progress, the progress made so far, and the governance measures in place to ensure ongoing success in implementation. At this point, the bank is able to report on the good practices it has adopted and how these practices have made or are making change to its business. The bank is able to fully complete the reporting and self-assessment template, indicating that it is in line with its commitments under the principles and provides evidence to support this, which is assured by a registered assurance provider that the bank works with and includes this in its report. In terms of the feedback, the bank will get feedback from UNEP FI on measures that it can take for the next year in order to maintain continued improvement and provide leadership towards implementation of the principles throughout the banking sector. So that's the hypothetical bank's process over a 4-year period. And I think we are open to questions.
Thank you very much, Nehru, for talking us through the steps that the fictitious bank takes over a 4-year period. canvassing each of the principles over those years. And just to reiterate that this is simply an example. Yeah, so it is simply an example, and also that it's canvasses the first 4 years, but the journey is not done at that point. These are just the first 4 years of the bank really building on its foundation, setting its targets. But I mean, there would be further work to be done to build on the work that the bank has done within those first 4 years. As Neru said, the bank would set a target. When it gets close to meeting that target, the bank would then consider, okay, well, let me do my impact analysis once more to see what my next most significant impact is, and then start working on setting a target in that area in order to make sure that it's got, 2 targets at any one time. So thanks again to Neru. Do we have questions at this point? There are a couple that have come through in writing. So Maria Eugenia Velazzi has asked, where can we download the impact analysis methodology documents? So we do have Word versions of the documents that can be found on the Positive Impact part of the UNEP FI website, but you can also follow links from the guidance documents. I must, however, state that the tools still are in development, and so when you do look at those, please just bear that in mind. If you would like to join the working group, Maria, please get in touch with us. We can add you to our mailing list, walk you through the tool as it has been developed to this point. All right. So I hope that answers that question. And then you ask, do you have examples of banks which identified negative impact? So I mean, we are right at the beginning of this process, and a lot of banks will be undertaking their impact analysis over the next few months. So that's really where we are in this process. But I would invite you to come on board, join the impact working group. I think there's a lot of learnings to be made there, and see how the tool develops. Right? Okay.
Can I add to that?
Of course, Neru, go ahead.
Just some idea. I know generally we're not really comfortable talking about our negative impacts, but just to give an example. So I work in an agricultural bank, and part of the potential negative impacts that arises from our lending is that our clients may not be using climate smart agriculture. So they may be using fertilizers that contribute to soil degradation. So that for me would be one of the negative impacts that I could be focusing on in terms of how do I guide my client to use maybe different materials in their production process. Sure.
Thank you very much, Neru. Marius, Demetrius, I don't know if you want to come in at this point. I think Neru, thank you very much in addressing the question that came from Andrea around, can you give us a few examples of financial institutions' negative impact on the environment and society? So thank you very much for that, Neru. Marius, Demetrius, anything to add to that question?
Puleng, I really don't have anything to add. I think Neru was very, very clear in how we look at the negative impacts, because I just wanted to stress that the one of the fundamental approaches of the principles is that we have a holistic approach to our impact. So we look at the positive ones, we want to make them to scale them up, but at the same time we have to look at the negative ones and try to reduce them. And there's always, depending on the methodologies that a bank can use, you can, and depending on the country where it operates and all the rest, it will be able to identify various both positive and negative ones. And working on the negative ones can be very, very helpful in achieving your targets. So, probably more than just setting targets for upscaling your positive ones. So I think it's very important that you work on both the positive and negative ones, and make sure that you be able to monitor to see what the results are.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Marius, go ahead.
This is Mariura. I just would add that the negative impact does not specifically maybe imply a bank decision to participate in an activity or sector that does not contribute to any of the society's goals, but it sometimes, as it was mentioned just before, sometimes it has to do with some of our clients' practices, or maybe because we are financing a sector that we may all use different standards that do not allow us to finance different sectors. But sometimes, as is the case in Mexico, all the topic of the oil is centralized in one large state company that where our bank and many, at least most of the large banks in Mexico, do participate at some point in financing some parts or of their operations. So becoming a signatory does not imply that from one day to another all of your activities can be labeled as sustainable, but you can detect and you can take a look at what are these parts of your portfolio that do not mainly contribute, and eventually try to reduce the negative impacts of that, or work towards a portfolio that is more aligned. So we have the time and the opportunity to detect all these activities, sectors, and financing that we do into non-aligned activities. And the important thing is to be transparent about it and to detect all that and work towards reducing the negative impacts.
Thank you very much, Marius. All right, so one more question before we move on to the next presentation. There's a question from Larissa Melendez, and she asked, is there any document that links GRI indicators with the principles for responsible banking? Are any of the banks wanting to maybe provide a response to that? Marius, Demetrius, Nero?
So, I'll give it a response, and maybe you can add. So, just to indicate that in terms of reporting templates, there has not been that alignment with the GRI or any other reporting template as yet. I mean, this is something that one could consider going forward for the principles for responsible banking. But I don't know, Puleng, within the Secretariat, in terms of reporting frameworks, what would you think about?
Puleng, I can't hear you.
Puleng, I think you're muted on your side.
Nero, can you hear me?
Yes, yes, I can.
So the problem is probably with Puleng.
Yeah.
Hello,
Marius, can you
are you?
hear us?
Yeah, now I can hear you.
Okay, I think, Demetrius, are you able to hear me now?
Now we can hear you, yes.
Okay, sorry about that. My telephone line died and I just was not aware of it, I think, for a couple of minutes. So we were responding to a question. Thank you very much for those on the line who alerted me to the fact that I had lost audio. So Larissa, I'm not sure how much of what I was saying you heard. I was saying that we do make reference to the GRI in the guidance document, and that if a bank is already reporting in line with the GRI, it provides a good foundation for reporting on the principles. If you want to discuss it further, be happy to take that offline with you. Yeah, apologies for the time that we lost. Demetrius, I think let's hand over to you for a presentation on the illustrative examples of target setting.
Thank you, Puleng. And thank you for this opportunity for sharing with the rest of the banks this how the guidance document works. We have a good idea what the principles are. We have a very good idea of how a bank could go about implementing the principles in a time span of 4 years. We're going to now dive into how we actually can set targets, and we will use this fictitious bank to set 2 examples of targets. One will be on an environmental issue and the other would be on a social issue. So the first example is setting targets to contribute to the goal of meeting the Paris Agreement, which is how we can work together how we can work as a bank to keep global warming well below 2 degrees Celsius and strive for 1.5 degrees Celsius. So once a bank, as we described before, has gone through its impact analysis, and that is something that the bank should be doing in the first year, the bank has assessed its portfolio and now it is able to identify the sectors that it should focus on. And in this case, in this example, the sectors are 3: energy, transport, and agriculture. Now, within these sectors, the bank has identified the technologies it is exposed to, and it is exposure to key clients in those sectors. This has enabled it to determine its baseline, which means the starting point. And determining your baseline in target setting is an absolute requirement, because that is the only way you know how you can compare against the baseline, how you can monitor and measure your progress. So you have to know where you start, you have to know where what your base is, and then you'll be able to follow up on your progress. Now, with the use of the scenarios, the bank was able to establish that aligning the identified sectors with a well below 2 degrees goal and striving for the 1.5 would require in its country of operation. And having this into mind, the bank was able to set its target, and this is an overall target, to align the bank's funding and investment to the energy, transport, and agricultural sectors with a well below 2 degrees Celsius goal, striving for 1.5 Celsius over a certain period of time, over an X amount of years. So this is the target that the bank has set. And we'll move on to the next slide, Puleng. Now, once you set a target, you determine the measures. What do you do exactly in order, what can you do practically to achieve its targets and measure progress against its starting point? Now, these measures may include working with key clients in the identified sectors towards achievement of the target, identifying new technologies the bank could expand into, engaging with policymakers, government transport agencies, and other stakeholders to understand how the bank can contribute effectively to making transport systems more sustainable. And last, developing methodologies with peers and experts that will guide the bank and ensure it achieves its target. Once you've set your target, once you've determined what your measures are, the last thing you have to do is to establish KPIs so that you can monitor your progress against this target. And these KPIs, in this case, in this example, may include reduce exposure to carbon-intensive technologies by 60% within X amount of years, increase funding and invest in renewable energy by X percentage annually, introduction of conditions in loan agreements requiring methods of agriculture that result in reduced greenhouse gases emissions by X amount of years, or by year whatever, and partnership with government transport agencies to support public transport infrastructure by X year. So this is the concept of setting targets. You have a general target, you determine your measures, and then you set your KPIs. The bank can also assess whether there are potential negative impacts that may arise as a result of these targets and put measures in place for mitigating them. This is something that we stressed before, and it's also very important to bear this in mind, because you might be investing in new technologies, and at the same time you might be creating, you might be leading people losing their jobs because they are working in old technology. So that is something that, you know, a bank will have to take into consideration. How do you deal with both the negative and not only both the negative and the positive impacts of your activities? Let's move to the next slide. And this is, yes?
But they're having a meeting as well. Say online conference kind of thing.
I can hear some background noise. Is this?
If you're busy, I can come back. I think they will finish in half an hour. Okay, they're here. Okay.
I will carry on. The second example is on a social issue. The bank identified gender equality as an area where it could have significant impact. It intends to set a target to contribute to the achievement of gender equality, namely SDG number 5, with particular focus on indicator 5.5.2, which reads proportion of women in managerial positions in its country. Now, the bank begins by determining its baseline, and it does that by assessing the proportion of its commercial lending portfolio that is attributed to companies with equal gender representation at the board and senior managerial level. Once it has established its baseline, the bank sets its target. For example, 50% allocation of corporate lending to companies with equal gender representation at board level and in management functions within X years. Now, once it has set the target, the bank establishes its measures, the measures it will take to meet these targets. These include, for example, identifying existing clients to work with, developing incentives to encourage existing and prospective clients to work towards gender equality. The bank recognizes that it must ensure that it is living up to its standards with its own organization in order to have the requisite credibility to encourage other organizations. So there's no point in saying that I will be investing in companies that, for example, would like to see more females working in managerial positions when the bank per se is not doing anything about that. So it has to assess the proportion of women in board and senior managerial positions within the bank, as well as in its primary procurement partners, and decides to work towards creating gender equality within its organization, as well as working with its customers. Next slide. The bank has set its target, it had set its measures, and now let's look at the KPIs, the possible KPIs that the bank has set to monitor progress against the target. We'll look at the outside, what the bank, the KPIs that the bank has set for outside the organization, so like dealing with its customers. X percentage increase in loans provided to companies with an equal gender representation at board level and senior management level per year. Engagement with X percentage of identified existing corporate clients to encourage them to develop gender equality policies within X amount of years. Provision of X percentage of loans in the corporate portfolio by year X, linked to incentives for corporate clients who achieve equal gender representation at board level. And now let's see that the KPIs that the bank can set within its organization. Policies have been revised to facilitate and ensure gender equality at board level and within the organization within X years. X percentage increase in the number of training opportunities and bursaries available to women within the bank in X years. Equal representation of women and men in senior managerial positions, including the board, within the next X years. The gender pay gap closed within X amount of years, and X percentage of all procurement from companies with gender equal representation at board level and senior management level by X date. It also puts measures in place for mitigating negative impacts that could result from activities associated with the achievement of this target. So this is something we'll always have to keep in mind, not only the positive impacts, but also the negative impacts. Always have a holistic approach in how we deal with our targets and measures that we implement. Thank you very much, Pauline.
Thank you very much, Demetrius. Thank you. And yes, as a number of the banks that I've presented have said, the principles very much are about banks having a holistic look at or analyzing their impact in a holistic way, so that they understand both their positive as well as their negative impact, and then set targets to address the impacts that are their most significant ones. All right, so I do not have any further questions in my mailbox at the moment. I do encourage you to please write to us, or you can put your hand up. We've got one more slide to go before we open up to Q&A. So maybe we can have some hands. I do see that we've got some familiar names who have attended the webinar that we have had discussions with before. So do feel free to raise your hand and I'll unmute you so that then we can hear your question, and between myself and the banks we can address this. So moving on into our final slide, which is about the steps going forward. So the signatories, we would encourage you to join the working group on impact identification. We've spoken quite a lot over this webinar about impact analysis. And so here is a group of banks working together with the banking team and the positive impact team here at UNEP FI to develop a tool for impact analysis, a way that banks can, work through their portfolio to understand their impacts better, and obviously that then leads into target setting. We also encourage banks to sign up or join the collective commitment to climate action. We currently have 34 banks that have committed to this, and we encourage more banks to come on board. Those banks will also be working in a community of practice with experts to develop methodologies that will assist with setting targets. As far as our work program is concerned, we will be proceeding with a gaps and needs analysis, which really means that we'll be sending a template around roughly in maybe about 2 weeks or so to the signatories for them to complete. And what this will serve to do is for the banks to really have a internally get those discussions going if they're not already going ahead, to really assess, okay, well, what are we planning to do? What do we need? What support do we need in embarking on implementing the principles? And it will then also inform what the work program for the principles will look like in the year ahead. We would then also encourage any banks that are on this webinar who have not become signatories as yet to get in touch with us. Let's have a discussion. If you have questions that needs to be addressed, let's do that, and let's bring you on board. As I said at the beginning of the webinar, 3/4 of the UNEP FI banking membership has already signed up to the principles. And so that's where we leave the presentation, and we now open for questions. So let's see if there are any hands. There is one hand from Laura, who is from GLS. So Laura, I have unmuted you. You should be able to speak if you unmute yourself. Laura, I don't see that you're able to speak for some reason. Let us, maybe if you could write something in the chat box. Sorry about that. I can't seem to unmute you. Perhaps write to us, and then we'll respond. Am I hearing a voice coming through on the line? Okay, no. Okay, so we have a question here from Michelle Espinache, and she says, if you decide to include climate targets in the principles, can they work also for the climate commitment on climate action? So perhaps we could hand over to the banks. Demetrius, do you perhaps want to go first in answering that?
Well, since climate change is one of the major issues that we would like to tackle through supporting sustainable financing, this is why we was one of the issues that we discussed when we were working on the principles was to see if we can have some collective targets, and every year we will sort of decide on which collective target we would like to focus on as banks, because that will help us create synergies, and it will help us through peer learning to develop methodologies and tools so that we can meet these common targets. So the first one that we set this year was the target for climate action, and there's I'm not sure, about 20 or so banks that are, or around 30 banks I would say, that have signed up to this commitment. And it's a very, very good opportunity because it, according to this commitment, it allows for 2 years within which the banks will jointly work together with UNEP FI to create the methodologies and the tools that we need so that we can set targets in dealing with climate change. So I suggest that it's a very good opportunity for banks that really would like to align with Paris Climate Agreement and don't know how to do it exactly, to join this group and learn through all the peer learning, how we can actually go about setting targets and methodologies.
Thank you very much, Demetrius. Do any of the other banks want to also provide a response, add anything to that? Okay, that sounds like a no. All right, so thanks, Demetrius, for responding to that. All I can add is that if you join the collective commitment, yes, every bank that signs up to the principles needs to set 2 targets. And so, yes, that would be one of those 2 targets. All right, then let us move on to the next question from Catalina Cano. Hello, my name is Catalina from Banco Colombia Group. I would like to know if the self-assessment report that must be published in 18 months should be included in the yearly report or can be published apart in our website. Do any of the banks want to come in to respond to that? Perhaps Neru or Marius?
Well, the first report is, if I understood the question, the first report has to be presented 18 months after becoming a signatory, and the idea is to include the advance on the progress of the implementation of the principles in the reports that we already do as banks, using the template that was developed for us signatories to report. So the main idea is that we do not need to do a separate report on a different moment of the year. We just need to include in the reports that we produce every year to our stakeholders the progress on the implementation of the principles. I don't know if this was the question and if this helps.
I think that definitely helps, Marius. Thanks. Maybe to take it a step further. So yes, the reporting and self-assessment template does need to be filled out on an annual basis. The first one would be due together with the bank's reporting, which is required within the first 18 months of the bank signing up to the principles. So, Catalina, the template can either be in the report, or you can publish it publicly. So, either way works. I assume that you're asking that question because of how your reporting works, but we can discuss that further if you would like. I don't know if Demetrius or Neru want to come in on this point.
Yep, Puleng, I think the point Marius made around that what the principles is not expecting is additional reporting or an additional report. I think that's an important point. It's about how do you, in terms of the template, when you look at it and complete it, you are referencing aspects of your report that reflect your implementation of the principles. I think that's important, is to say it's not aimed at increasing the burden in terms of your reporting.
Absolutely.
I would just like to add that the template actually helps us and guides us as to what we should be reporting in our report, and it will help the assurer to assure that what we say is actually what we're doing. So that is the role of the template, basically.
Thank you very much. So the next question, again from Michelle, and she asks, will there be approved firms by UNEP FI to do the limited assurance? Any bank want to start on that? Or you happy
what was the question? Can you repeat the question again?
Will there be approved firms by UNEP FI to do the limited assurance?
Well, I don't know if you have to answer that question. All I know is that most banks are actually already working with various assurers within their own countries. So all I think that a bank should do is work closer with their assurers, make sure that they understand what the principles are and what are required by the principles to be reported, and what they can and how they can assure what they should be assuring. And I think that we will be providing further guidance to the assurers so that they could do a better job. But I don't think there'll be any recommended companies or consultancies, not that I know of.
Agreed. No, we will not be recommending assurance providers. Most, if not all, of the banks that we've engaged with already are, they already have an assurance process. And so, the expectation is that most banks will just include this in the assurance process that they already undergo around the non-financial reporting. So, Michelle, I hope that addresses that question. We've got a question from Andrea Cordero, and she asks, what practices from other banks that have a longer trajectory with UNEP FI would you recommend for a new signatory? Andrea, that one is not would you. Okay, so let's try this again. I see you've corrected. So what practices from other banks that have a longer trajectory with UNEP FI would you recommend for new signatories? I am still not 100% clear on this one. Neru, Marius, Demetrius, are you clearer on what the question is asking?
I'm not sure myself, Pulang, but I'm assuming it's sort of which of the banks do you look towards in terms of maybe they further along in their sustainability journey. And I mean, the point really is that all of us are new signatories to this process. So we're all very much on a journey, and there's no specific bank that's going to be recommended to any of the signatories. I think it's very much to look at what the guidance provides in terms of enabling any signatory, be it the core group of banks or additional signatories since then, in terms of how do you start implementing this. I mean, I don't know if Demetrius or Marius has a different view.
No, Nero, I don't have a different view. I just wanted to clarify that, you know, one of the benefits of joining, becoming a signatory, for those that are not signatories, and for those that already are signatories, is that, you know, by working together in this community of banks, we will have the opportunity to exchange, you know, various experiences. You know, no bank probably has, you know, a full solution to all the issues that come up, but, you know, different banks might have different solutions for different issues. So one of the benefits of being a signatory is that we will have peer learning opportunities, and this is, you know, something that all banks should be following so that we can really learn from each other.
And this is Marius. I would also add something. It is very important to understand that the principles are a journey, and they are a constant journey. So no bank will be done with the implementation of the principles at a specific period of time. It will be a constant journey because we need to have, since we, at the moment we establish targets, we always need to have two targets that are still going on and that we are still working to meet them in a specific period of time. So it doesn't matter where the bank is at the beginning of this journey. As it was mentioned, I think by Neru, we are all new signatories, and it doesn't matter where we are starting. The guidance document and the implementation of the principles are thought to be implemented by any bank that is starting the journey or that is more advanced in the sustainability field. So this is something that we are all working on, no matter in which point we started as signatories.
Thank you very much, Marius, Neru, and Demetrius, for your responses there. Yeah, I just wanted to hop on a bit about this peer learning aspect, and that, you know, we have said repeatedly that the principles are for any bank, regardless of where it is in its sustainability journey. And peer learning is something that we're going to be developing quite a lot over the next few months. You know, and because it's important for banks to learn from each other. As was said by the banks on this call, some banks have strengths in one area and other banks have strengths in other areas, and it's for banks to really learn and grow from, you know, learnings from each other. So that's definitely one means of support that is provided to signatory banks, so that all banks are progressing and learning together, and really, you know, going down this road of implementation together, problem solving together. Andrea, I hope that responds to your question adequately. Let's move on to a comment from Kauri, who is our regional coordinator based in Japan. And her comment is, she does say it may be a comment rather than a question regarding target setting. It is for the banks themselves, but at the same time, it is signaling to companies or lendees as set targets to be disclosed, and the existing or potential lenders or lendees may have a chance to look at those. Kauri, I think maybe what you're asking here is around the setting of public targets. Targets are set publicly because, the principles, central to the principles is this idea of accountability and transparency. And so banks would set their targets in the areas where they have, the most significant impact. They set them publicly, they report publicly on them, so that, their stakeholders then know how they are proceeding in terms of those targets. If there is something further that I need to address in what you said, please do write again, and I'll have a look at that. Let us see. There is a further question here from Kari. Are there any reactions or responses from companies or lendees so far? Kari, again, just will you contextualize that, and then we'll respond to it. There is another question from Maria Eugenia Belazzi, and she says, will we have the reporting and self-assessment template in Spanish in the next month? So here we have already, I assume you've seen the translations that we already have online. We do have, I think, the principles and maybe the key steps already translated into Spanish. And what we encourage is for signatory banks to come together and to work on translations of the various documents. And so here it would be the reporting and self-assessment template, and then also the guidance document. I've had other banks also ask around having a translated version of the guidance document. So that is something that regional coordinators will be working with banks in the region on to see where there is capacity to develop translations. There's another question here, which is, will we have the reporting? Okay, I've already answered that one. Thanks for the valuable webinar. Okay, so that is from a bank that's had to leave. Kari, yours is the only one that's outstanding. If I could perhaps hear more from you around this point. Are there any reactions or responses from companies or lendees so far? Maybe what I can do is ask the banks whether you are founding signatories, Neru, Marius, and Demetrius. Have you had any kind of reactions from clients, from stakeholders, that you interact with, that you provide services to, around, having become signatories to the principles?
Well, on our behalf, Puleng, I don't think we have any specific response as yet from clients or customers, but we do have a big publicity in the media. So I assume that in the next few months we'll be seeing some kind of reaction, and as the principles will be becoming a little bit more, how can I say, contextualized in this part of the world.
Thank you very much, Demetrius. Anything to add, Neru, Marius?
I think similarly, Puleng, there's quite rapid movement in the financial sector around the principles for responsible banking, in that I think it's being based on the launch in September. People are far more aware, and part of our sort of stakeholders are now quite eager to learn a little bit more about what are we doing towards implementation and what does it mean for the financial sector as a whole. So there's growing momentum around better understanding what the principles are and what they could mean for the financial sector in South Africa.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Neru. Marius, anything from your side?
Yes, I would add that in general, from our stakeholders, different stakeholders have expressed that they celebrate our signing into the principles for responsible banking. This is something interesting in our specific case in Mexico. We are from all the 5 largest financial groups and banks in Mexico, we are the only ones that are Mexican and that do not have like a global bank that is more advanced in many of the topics. So it has been, I think, that widely celebrated that a Mexican bank was participating in a global banking initiative to promote sustainability and to align our operations. So it has been positive. And also, I do believe that if we do not do a lot of communication as to what this involves, it can also send different messages that are misunderstood. So many people has approached us in terms of, is the bank going to do more donations to different topics? And I have been approached to and asked for donations, and they relate that to a responsible banking, and these principles imply a lot more. It implies really doing a total business strategy around alignment to society's goals, and not only doing more donations. So that we need to communicate more. What is this?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's such an important point, Marius, that it's it goes much further than making donations and those kinds of activities. And what we're talking about here is really for banks to look at their business strategies, to look at the way that they do business, and to consider what society's key goals are. And when we talk about society, we're talking about the context that they operate in. What are society's goals? What are the priorities in their country, and to really make sure that their strategy isn't running counter to those, and to see how they can work to have impact in those areas. So thank you very much for that. We have run over time, and so I think we're going to leave it there. I don't think we have any further questions. So yeah, I think we will close on that point. Thank you very much to the banks that have presented, Neru, Demetrius, and Marius. Thank you very much for presenting so well. We've received a number of comments in the box saying thank you very much. It has been very informative. If any of the banks that are participating in this webinar have any further questions for us, or questions that arise after the webinar, we encourage you to get in touch with us. We obviously also encourage banks, I'll reiterate, who have not signed up to the principles, to get in touch with us. Signatories, please do get involved, get in touch with us to participate in the impact working group in that stream of work. Also to join the collective commitment to climate action, so that you can also participate in that work as banks work together with experts to figure out, okay, how do we actually set these targets, and then obviously look out for the gaps and needs analysis templates that we will be sharing with signatory banks. As I said, this will inform what our work program looks like, and it really will serve the purpose of helping us to understand how to best support our signatories and which areas we need to prioritize. So thank you very much to everybody who has participated in this webinar. Have a great day further or evening, depending on where you're calling from. And with that, I will end the webinar.
Thank you, Pauline.
Thanks, Nera.
Bye, Pauline. Thanks.
Cheers, Marius.